And it's interesting because that is the last chapter. I'm not sure what the lesson's going to be about the next couple of weeks. But anyway, I didn't look ahead. But anyway, it's, and this memory text, talk about guarding the gates on the Sabbath. We'll get into that more in the lesson, but everything we study in the Sabbath school lesson, there needs to be a way to apply it to our own life. And in this case, this one verse is very easy to me about guarding the gates. On the Sabbath, do we need to guard against the intrusion of the world? We need to sanctify ourselves, cleanse ourselves, and hold the world at bay. Shut the gates. Don't let any of that outside influences in on the Sabbath. So we'll keep on going. And it talks about the interim between chapter 12 and 13. Nehemiah returns to Babylon. We don't know how long he was there. We have, kind of some ideas, but we don't know exactly how long Nehemiah was in Babylon before he got permission from the king to come back and continue being governor in or Jerusalem area around that. So it's interesting. He wasn't gone very long, but this whole lesson talks about the things that happened while he was gone. It kind of reminds me how fast things can deteriorate, just like when Moses went up with the people and went up to the mount and got the 10 Commandments. By the time he got back down, they had lost their mind. I mean, dancing around the golden calf and worshiping it and all of these things, so bad that God really, if Moses hadn't prayed for him, he was ready to just wipe them out, start over something else. So it doesn't take long to lose your spirituality if you don't pay attention, if you don't follow the things you know to be true. Like these people, remember earlier in the lesson where they talked about they made, not in this lesson, but in the quarter, where they made the covenant between them and God on the things they would do? They said they would not intermarry with idolaters. Well, not only they did it, not only, even their leaders, their high priest had family members who married with idolaters. Second, they, in their covenant, was to observe the Sabbath carefully. Well, as we read Nehemiah, we see that they didn't observe the Sabbath carefully. They let other things creep into them. And we'll get to that, but it's interesting how you can justify certain things. And third, to take care of the temple and its personnel by tithe and offerings. Well, we know about that. You got to pay your tithe and offerings. Why do we need to pay our tithe and offerings? A couple of reasons. We'll get into that. But number one is God told us to. Give us an example of it. But anyway, let's keep going. Anyway, Nehemiah, when he got back after this short time in Babylon, he couldn't believe what he had found. He couldn't believe how far the people had, as it said in the beginning of the lesson, backslidden people. He couldn't believe how far they had went backwards in their spirituality. They were ignoring it. They had got back. He even had to remind them, do you remember that what got us in this captivity in the first place? Do you remember what put us in this shape? All of these things you're doing now is what put us in this shape to start with. Anyway, let's start with Sunday's lesson, tainted temple leadership. Nehemiah 13, like I said, the whole lesson is taken mostly from Nehemiah 13. It's very interesting. I read what Ellen White said about this, and then I also read about what in the Concordance, not the concordance. The Adventist or set of books. What do you call them? Commentaries, exactly. Commentaries. I read about it in the commentaries. And Ezra and Nehemiah, the two books, are so closely connected that for many hundreds of years, they were one book. They made up one book. And then the Hebrews did. And then they split it out into book 1, book 2, and book 3. And finally, it wasn't till Jerome came along that they split it into book of Ezra and the book of Nehemiah. That tells you how close these two books are together, and you can see why they put them together in this lesson. They're over some of the same time period, or almost all the same time period. And it's just interesting. If you read in the commentaries and read in Spirit of Prophecies, there's so much things that, we can read the facts from different places, but then you take somebody who can study it and put it all together, you can draw conclusions that weren't necessarily there in black and white. And so it makes it interesting to read these things. Nehemiah 13:1 to 3. After a year, about a year later, I returned from Persia. And that's interesting, Persia. That's what he calls Babylon, because the Persians are who captured Babylon. So Babylon had become Persia. And decided from what I saw to call the people together. Then I ordered the book of Moses to be read aloud. It clearly stated that no Ammonite or Moabite should be allowed into the sanctuary courtyard. These two nations had not only refused to offer the Israelites food and water when they came out of Egypt after wandering into the deserts, but the Moabites had also hired Balaam, the backslidden prophet, to curse God's people. It was only the power of God that turned the curse into a blessing. When the people heard this experience read to them, they separated from Israel all foreigners whose ancestry went back to these two locations. Now, as I read, like I said, I read in several different places about that. When they talk about separating from them, it doesn't mean they ran them completely out of the country. When they talk about things, it's like in the sanctuary worship, when they would all get together as a group, almost like voting. Only citizens are allowed to vote. And the same way with this, it's a separation between the two groups, or between the Jews and everybody else. And also, when it talks about these countries and what they had done, and the people, those two countries, the Ammonites and the Moabites, it also calls them idolaters. And in studying, I've come to realize they are talking more about the idolaters than they are those particular people from those countries. Now, most of those people were from idolaters that were from Samaria and different places around there. And that's how come they didn't want them. But it wasn't because exactly of the country they were from, but it was because of their idolatry. Just like we talk about now Israel, we're talking about who are the Jews, who is Israel now? Christ's people are considered Israel nowadays. God still has a spot for Israel, but he's not talking about country over there with Jerusalem in it. He's talking about his people. And the same way, so when they talk about Israel, they're not talking about just the people who live there. They're talking about all of God's people. And in the same way, when they're talking about the Ammonites and the Moabites, he's not just talking about them. He's talking about the idolaters that they had at that time. Yeah, like it says in the lesson, it says, these verses do not speak about driving away individuals from a different nation or race who followed God, but rather they refer to sending away those who were different in faith. You know, just like in the U.S., we will take people who follow in, who want to become citizens, and we accept them. The same way they accepted people who changed their faith at that time. They didn't try to drive those out. But as we study on, it does talk about those two countries and the people who lived there, and the idolaters. And Nehemiah 13, 1-9, it says, we're not going to read all that, but it says, who were Eliashib and Tobiah? Why is what they did unacceptable? Okay. The first one, Eliashib, maybe okay, Eliashib. He was the high priest. All those texts that list down there, it tells us about these people, so we know who they are and what position they had. And then we talk about Tobiah. Now, Tobiah, he was against Nehemiah from the very beginning. He was one of those that when Nehemiah came through the countries and everything and telling them what his goal was, he was very upset about it. And as we study this lesson, we understand where the trouble came in. It says Tobiah is mentioned as the Ammonite enemy of Nehemiah, who vehemently opposed his work in Jerusalem. It also talks about this relationship probably came about because of marriage. These two men became friends, worked together, and probably because the marriage got them together. It says, even though records of marriage connections have not been preserved, we know that Tobiah had a Jewish name, meaning the Lord is good, and he was an Ammonite. And this most likely came from a Jewish background. Maybe his wife's family, the descendants of Era, though unidentified, are believed to have been related to Eliashib. And it talks about, and also his grandson married the granddaughter of Sanballat, the Horonite, which is another one of the people who were so against Nehemiah coming back, who hated it, they despised it, they tried to start rumors about, they're going to revolt against the kingdom, they're going to try to set up their own kingdom, tried all these things to cause trouble for Nehemiah as he came back. So we've got these two men, we've got their families all intertwined together. This came from them marrying idolaters. When the Bible talks about us being unequally yoked, it's talking about our faith, what we believe. How difficult is that? When we, just as they did in that time, nowadays you see people who marry unbelievers, and it's very difficult for them to continue in the church in the way that they had all of their life. They could be lifelong members, but it's very difficult when you're with an unbeliever. And so it makes it much more, we can understand it, how that happens, how that happened back then. But these were with Nehemiah out of town, back at Rome, Eliashib was really the one in charge, the high priest. With the governor gone, he was the man in charge. And so he was allowing these things to happen, the intermarriage and that sort of thing. And it says, during the governor's absence, the high priest gave Tobiah one of the rooms in the temple that was designated to hold tithe, gifts, and offerings. Tobiah was granted permanent residence in the temple, a way of establishing him one of the leaders of the nation. The enemies of Nehemiah had finally achieved what they wanted all along, to displace Nehemiah and be in charge themselves. Fortunately, Nehemiah wasn't going to sit by and let that happen. Okay, now, they had given him a place, it says in the temple, but on further reading, if you were out of town, you talked about the church, something happened at the church, we're talking about probably the school, the room, the community service building, all these things we consider the church. And it says this room that he was given was actually a room used, as it says, for storing offerings, gifts, even some of the temple vessels that they used in their sacrifice. And it was in we know the outline of the temple. We've seen that before. We know what it's like. It was a place connected to it, but not actually in the temple, which might have made it a little bit easier for them to do, because it's not actually in the temple. It's in a storeroom over here to the side. It's not actually in the temple, because they were questioned, and they had to have some reason, some excuse for doing that, even though they could do it just because they were in charge, the high priest. But still, everybody has to answer to somebody sometime. So that was one way they could look at that. And why it was so bad, we just got through talking about where God said, and where Nehemiah talked about separating those people from the Jews and from the congregation. Not out of the country, but out of the congregation. Well, how do you separate somebody out of the church when they're living there? That made it totally impossible. And it also gives Tobiah a certain, people thought higher of him because, he's living in the temple. Of course, that gives him a special, if I was living in the White House, you all might think I was something special for some reason. And in the same way with him living there, he had that aura around him of living in the temple, which he did not deserve, shouldn't even be there, and was completely wrong. And when Nehemiah got there, he could not believe the situation. He could not believe how things had happened. He saw what had happened there. And I don't know if Tobiah wasn't there at that time or what. He's probably lucky he wasn't, if he wasn't, because it said Nehemiah went in and cleaned it out. Threw everything out of the room. Probably burn it, if Nehemiah seemed kind of that type of person. But anyway, he emptied the room and had it cleansed. Probably sacrificial type cleansing. So it's very important. It said, why do God's people all through sacred history, whether Jews in ancient Israel or Christians who followed them during and after New Testament times, so easily allow themselves to be led astray? And how can we avoid that? Somebody have an answer? How could they let themselves so easily be led astray? Any answers for that? We have even less excuse. They didn't all have the Bible that they could read every day. They went to the temple regularly, but they didn't have the Bible to read, but they still had prophets from God explaining them. Yes, go ahead.
I think One of the answers I came up with was Isaiah 29, verse 13. And it says, "Wherefore the Lord said, for as much as this people draw near me with their mouth and with their lips, do honor me, but have removed their heart far from me, and their fear toward me is taught by the precept of men." So many times we put our hearts and our desires. And going back to something you said about Nehemiah, we need more men of God like Nehemiah who stand up for what was right, even though it seemed he stood alone. Because sometimes we do compromise who we rent our church to, who we rent spaces or whatever to. So we need more men who stand up for that which is right.
That's very good, very true. And you know, also, Nehemiah found that the Levites and the singers and the people who worked in the temple had gone away, a lot of them. And he wondered why. So he checked into it, and he discovered they weren't getting paid. You know, because everyone else in the country had their land allotted to them. They could raise their own food. They could make the money to take care of themselves. But it was very clearly stated that the Levites did not get a land given to them because they were to be worshipers or leaders in the temple and would live off of the tithe and offerings and sacrifices that were given. And so, and it also, these two Sunday and Mondays tie together. Would you feel like giving to the temple if Tobiah was living in one of the guest rooms in the temple? You can see how that would influence people. One of the things to cause them to, you know, if they're going to spend their money like this, I'll do something else with my money. And because, you know, he's living in this room. It didn't say there was a kitchen. It didn't, you know, it talked like it was more of a storeroom. So he was probably eating with them most of the time. So basically, he was being room and board given there. So you can understand how the people were upset about that. It says the singers, gatekeepers, and other temple servants had to go back to working in their own fields in order to feed their families because the work for God was not being supported. The whole tithes and offering system that was so painstakingly established now lay in ruins. Nehemiah had to start over. The act of throwing everything out of that room shows desperation. And it talks about how the temple, it had not only had the offerings been misapplied, but the temple had been profaned by having him live there. And so that had to change. They had to do special cleansing services to make this temple holy again. And it says this had to tend to discourage the liberalities of the people, the same way it would now. When our church, if our church wasted a lot of money, if we started supporting things that were not holy, not righteous with our funds, you know, I might keep my funds where I do some good with my own instead of turning it over to the church. But it definitely had an influence upon it. It also says the people were on Nehemiah's side. They saw what was going on. You can't fool the people. You know, the people understand. They see what's happening. They knew what was going on. And they realized that Nehemiah was doing everything for their benefit. So Nehemiah, he went in and set up new people to take care of things. It lists the people. There was like 4, basically we would call them treasurers. That's not what they listed them as. But he said some new treasurers to take care of things, to see that things were done right and correctly and money wasn't misappropriated. In other words, Nehemiah came in and uprooted the corrupt system of leadership seemingly in one fell swoop. You know, he had to have the authority from God. I was reading this lesson. Nehemiah wasn't a priest. Nehemiah wasn't a prophet. Now, where did he prophesy? Nehemiah was a leader who was dedicated to God. That's what he wasn't those other things that are very important, but you do not have to be a prophet to be able to be a leader for God. You do not have to be a priest to be a leader for God. Each one of us were born with the same qualities that Nehemiah had and the same things that we could do. Let's look at tithes and offerings. Boy, this can be a touchy subject with people because nobody wants someone else getting into their business. Nobody wants somebody else getting into their checkbook or their billfold. Leave my funds. I'll take care of that. It says Nehemiah reforms of the temple service included the implementation of tithes and offerings. Some time back somebody asked me, why do we give 10%? Well, as we look through the Bible, the different places, so many places it talks about the 10%. When Abraham met Melchizedek after defeating the enemy, what did he give him? That high priest, 10%. And after Jacob had wrestled with God overnight, and the next day when he was thinking clearly, he made the vow that he would give 10%. And there's other places in the Bible where that 10% comes from. And what does tithe go for? In our church, what does tithe go for? Somebody tell me. Supporting the ministry. This heater you hear running right now, that's not paid for by tithe. It's not the gas paid for by tithe. Tithe goes to support the ministry. It pays our pastors. It pays missionaries. It pays our division right on up, the conferences, the unions. What? Evangelism definitely can come out of tithe. All of these things, but not the day-to-day maintenance of the church nowadays. That's something that we have brought up. We could be meeting outside, but we'd still need to be paying tithe to support the ministry. And that's why it was so disheartening. How could a Levite or a priest do his job, or one of the singers, if they didn't have enough to eat? If they couldn't bring food to their family? It would be so discouraging. It would be very difficult to have. You can see why the country had kind of slid downhill. It says, without the collection of tithes and offerings, the temple could not function. When tithing stopped, the services in the temple fell apart, and the whole worship system was in jeopardy. As temple personnel went to look for other jobs to feed their families, they couldn't focus on taking care of the temple. Consequently, the worship of God diminished. That is so sad that the temple would, okay, how would it diminish? If I went in to talk to a priest or a Levite, do you ever go to a place and see a line stretched around the block and say, no, I'm not doing this? I do that all the time. It doesn't have to be a block either. It can be about 5 people. And unless I am forced to, I won't wait. And I'm sure a lot of these people were the same way. And if there was only 10 Levites where there should have been 100, and they had to wait all that time, well, they're going to go away. They're not going to give their money. They're not going to give their sacrifice. They'll go away. And as you separate yourself from, as they separated themselves from the temple, just like us, if we separate ourselves from the church, you lose contact. You lose that interest. You lose that wanting to know more about. You just, there's an old thing I've heard for years about a man went to visit somebody, and he said, "Why do I need to go to church?" They were sitting in front of the fireplace and everything, and looking at the fire, and they were talking. Said, "Why do I need to go to church? It's full of people I don't care about. There's nothing there, but I understand I need to go, but I don't really see the necessity of it." And the other guy, he just took one of the hot coals out of the fire and pushed it over to the side, and they talked a little bit. The coals were all bright red, and they talked a little bit, and pretty soon he said, "Now look at that coal I pushed away from the fire. It had got cold. It had lost its fire. It was not hot anymore. The rest of the fire still was. It had separated." It's the same way with us. And so anything like these Levites not being there that would cause a disruption in the temple service would cause people not to be there. It says when we talk about tithing, it says when God calls for the tithe, like he did in Malachi 3:10, he makes no appeal to gratitude or generosity. Although gratitude should be a part of all our expressions of God, we tithe because God commanded it, just like we do a lot of things. He will give us some good reasons, but the number one reason is he commanded it. The tithe belonged to the Lord, and he requested that we return it. Do you notice in the church, generally, sometimes we might make a mistake, but when they call for the offering, we say it's time to return our tithe and offering. Return. That signifies where it came from. It's God's. We're returning a portion back to him. So that returning is very important as we realize what's going on. Just as happened with the Israelite temple, our church would fall apart without the support of the members, tithes and offerings. Our church service would not function without people who are paid to put in time into their quality ministry planning and management of the church for God. It's important that our church has always had this policy. Our ministers don't work outside. This is their job.
I think one of the key things you said was God commanded it. Because earlier, as we discussed, if the treasurer is not doing right with the money, we may not return it. But whether they do right or not, we must return it. That's one. Number two, the tithe is fair. There are other faiths where they ask you to sow a seed of $1,000, where you don't even have $500. So whether you have 1,000 or 100, it is fair, and God will not ask for more than you have. And that's what I love about the tithe.
Right. As long as he's asking for a percentage, there's no way he's taking all your money. If you got $1, he's just asking for 10 cents. You still got 90. So there's no way that he's asking you to give everything you've got. So anyway, let's continue. But he set this system up, and it's one of those systems that he expects us to continue. Okay, let's run out of time. But let's look at Wednesday. Treading the wine presses on Sabbath. Okay, this goes clear back to the memory text that we had about closing the gates. Nehemiah 13, 15, and 16 says, it was also after my return to Jerusalem that I saw some of our people working the vineyards and grape presses on the Sabbath. Others were harvesting grain, and still others were loading their donkeys with either grain, grapes, or figs to take to the market that had been set up in Jerusalem for a special sale on the Sabbath. It didn't take long for me to put a stop to this and tell the people that nothing was to be sold on the Sabbath, whether inside or outside the city. I saw people from Tyre who had moved to Jerusalem and had set up their markets to sell fish and all kinds of other imported merchandise to our people on the Sabbath. So he saw all of these things going on. And as you study, it says some people wanted to make excuses. Well, if we're going to have a sale on Sunday, I need to get all this ready today. I'm not selling or buying anything, but I'm going to have everything ready, have my donkey loaded. I'm going to have it, but I'm not selling anything. Well, were they keeping the Sabbath holy? And also, it talks about, we're running out of time, I want to talk about the people from the other countries who came in, like it mentioned, the ones selling fish and different things. Sometimes they hide under the excuse, I'm not selling anything. It's these people from the other countries doing the selling. Now, I might buy something, but it's these people from the other countries that are doing the selling. And then when you had these people from other countries living in your city, the idolaters, the Jews could be just watching. There's the people selling, there's the people buying. And at that time, there wasn't a price tag that said $2, you walked and give them $2 and walked away. No, it was a process. Still a process over there to this day. How much do you want for that? $100. I'll give you 10. Oh, no, that's, you can go back and forth for 20 minutes or to buy something. Haggling. All of these things. I think that is as much the issue as of actual buying and selling is it took them away from worshiping Christ. It took their time away from spending time with Christ. Let other things come into their life. Nehemiah was in charge, so he felt it a moral obligation to take the position he did and then act upon it. So the Sabbath was created as the pinnacle of creation. Sometimes people take it as the Sabbath wasn't even created. He didn't do anything that day. He really created in 6 days. No, he created 7 days. The 7th day he created the Sabbath. It has been said that here's a quote, more than Israel kept the Sabbath kept Israel. Let me say that again. More than because Israel kept the Sabbath kept Israel. What does that mean? The Sabbath kept Israel.
Be close to God. It helped them in their way, in their Christian way.
Exactly. That's exactly right. It kept them focused. It kept them as a nation. It kept something that they all had in common, something they did together. They kept the Sabbath. Without the Sabbath, they could have been anywhere. They worshiped together on the Sabbath. It was such an important day. And it talks about what did Nehemiah do in order to stop the buying and selling. He shut the temple. Not the temple, excuse me. Shut the gates. Shut the gates. Now here's another lesson we can get from this. When did he shut the gates? At what time of day did he shut the gates? When the shadows started falling. He didn't shut the gates at midnight on Friday night, did he? He shut the gates when the shadows started falling on the gates. Okay, that's probably around sundown, or probably a little before, actually. And when did it say he opened them? He opened them after dark on the night after Sabbath. And so this is just one more place where the Bible tells us about when the Sabbath is, from sundown to sundown. So we can learn from everything. Okay, I want to finish this about the working on the Sabbath. And it talks about the people, but, these were the main gates that he shut. But he didn't shut the walk-through gates. He didn't, he was stopping people from carrying their donkeys and carts and all that. But, sometimes people needed to go in and out, so he didn't lock the walk-through gates. He put people watching it, saw that there was no commerce, no people bringing in, sack over their shoulder and open up their spot and start selling stuff. He kept that in mind, and he even put his own people there to watch that because he didn't trust the people who were there before. But what happened? What did the people from the other countries do who were outside the temple, outside the walls? They hung around the opening, didn't they? They hung around the gates. They hung around the outside of the walls. And if they're hanging around out there with all their stuff, you know what they were doing. We've all been around. They were selling stuff. You go to different places. If they're hanging around out there selling stuff, so the people would go outside, walk through the walk-through gate, and buy stuff. And Nehemiah, it took him a couple of weeks to figure that out. A couple of Sabbaths, he saw that. Then this is what I like. He went out and told them, clear out. If you're back again, I'm going to lay hands on you. And I don't think he meant he was going to pat them on the back and send them on their way. I don't know that there was a jail in Jerusalem. They usually just beat the people real hard and sent them on their way. That was how you were taken care of a lot in that time. So when he said he was laying hands on them, I don't know whether he meant he was going to haul them in and put them in jail, or he's just going to help a couple of Levites work them over real good and then send them on their way. But anyway, when he threatened them to lay hands upon them, when I was a kid, the last thing I wanted was my parents to lay hands on me, because that wasn't going to be a good situation when I had done something wrong. If it got serious in a hurry, and I'm sure that's how those people felt at that time too. So that he took care of that. He got that taken care of. Now we've got to finish this up right now. I wanted this last thing though. Sometimes you can get carried away. It says, in their zeal, however misguided, to make sure the Sabbath was not desecrated, those religious leaders who were so fanatical that they accused Jesus, the Lord of the Sabbath, of violating it. Talk about it taking a good thing too far. The irony is that while many of the men expressed great concern about the law, they forgot the weightier matter of the law, justice, mercy, and faith. Sometimes we have people who try to preach the letter of the law. You can't do this. All of that comes with, as it says here, with the weightier matters of the law, justice and mercy and faith. So whenever we try to impose our rules, our laws that are spiritual, we still have to use those three things. We still have to have justice and mercy and faith. If you try to impose God's law without having those, you're just going to cause a fight. You're going to cause hard feelings. You're going to not accomplish any of the things that you would like to happen. Okay, we've got to quit. We are out of time. Next week, dealing with bad decisions. Yeah, that ought to be good. Okay, let's bow our heads for prayer. Dear Heavenly Father, thank you so much for the blessings you've given us, for giving us Nehemiah to study from. Help us to gain the blessings and the lessons that you have given us in today's lesson, that we can understand what the importance of tithing, of keeping the Sabbath, and keeping ourselves holy. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.